Hi, Zach here, and before we jump into the more advanced tips, let's get started with some beginner focus tips. To quickly start the sculpting process, you can open a new sculpting file directly here in the splash screen or up here under File, New Sculpting. This brings us straight into the sculpting workspace with sculpt mode enabled, and instead of the default cube we get this nice subdivided sphere. That means we can start sculpting right away and maybe challenge us to create something just out of the sphere, and maybe recreating this little sketch I did the other day, getting into the sculpting zone, having too much fun and totally forgetting about time and space, just to end up with this little Godzilla sculpture that probably ate too many sweets. And what was this video about again? Yes, sculpting tips. So let's get to tip number 2. When you move your mouse over to the tool shelf, this double arrow appears here on the edge, and then you can drag it out, and then you get 2 rows of the tool shelf, so you see everything much better. And if you drag it even further, you can also see the names, which is especially useful when you are learning all the brushes and tools. And by the way, you can press Ctrl, to open up the preferences. You also find them up here. And then here under key map, you can change the spacebar action to tools, which allows you to press spacebar, hold, and then you can also see all the brushes and tools here, and then simply hover above one of these tools, release spacebar, and then you will switch to this specific brush or tool. So that means you could even press T to hide the tool shelf entirely and just use spacebar to switch to the specific brush you need. I'm here in object mode, and by the way, I'm using a graphics tablet for sculpting in Blender, which is a bit more intuitive. You find a link in the video description to a video where I show you what graphics tablet I'm using and how I set it up in a way that you can easily use the pen of the graphics tablet to navigate the 3D viewport instead of your mouse. And then you can go to the preferences and enable some additional options to make navigating the 3D viewport not only in sculpt mode but also in general much easier. For example, you can enable zoom to mouse position, which will detect the position of your mouse in the 3D viewport, and when you zoom in, it will zoom to this specific position. Then I would also recommend to enable depth. This allows us to get to specific spots on your 3D object because Blender detects the 3D surface underneath the mouse cursor. So if I zoom up here, you can see I can get to this specific spot, which is a bit further away, very easily. And then we have orbit around selection, which is especially useful for sculpt mode. Here in object mode, when one object is selected, it will orbit around this selected object, which is quite useful. However, if we go over to sculpt mode, this becomes even more useful because Blender remembers the last strokes we made and set the rotation origin to this specific spot. So here we have our last stroke, and if I now rotate the view, you can see that we are using this last stroke as pivot point for our viewport rotation. And if I make another stroke up here, you can see the viewport will now rotate around this specific spot. This is extremely useful to focus the navigation around the spot where you are sculpting at the moment. And then we can nicely rotate our view around our little Godzilla. What's going on? Why you're sad? You feel a bit ashamed that you ate too many sweets and you're now out of shape? No worries, you're still looking fantastic. However, if you like, I can help you to get in shape again, okay? Look, little Godzilla is much happier now, since I made him a little exercise mat and this headband, and now he can really get into exercising. However, now we have 3 different objects we might want to sculpt on, and in sculpt mode, unfortunately, I can't sculpt on multiple objects. So always switching back to object mode, selecting the other object, going back into sculpt mode is of course extremely tedious. Let's hit Ctrl, to open up the preferences, and here under key map, what I like to do is to enable pie menu on drag. Let's enable this. Now we can hold down tab and move our mouse in any direction, then this pie menu will appear, which allows us to easily switch to other modes. So I can hover above object mode and release tab, then I can select another object and switch to sculpt mode. This is much quicker, but still this is not the best way. A quicker way is to go up here into the outliner and click on these little dots, which will switch the object we are sculpting on. However, there's even a faster way you can do it. Right now we are in sculpt mode of Godzilla here, but if we want to switch over to the exercise mat, simply hover your mouse above this and press Alt Q. Then you can see it will shortly be highlighted, and then we know we are in sculpt mode of this specific object. When I go up here, press Alt Q, I can switch to the headband or back to Godzilla here with Alt Q. Super fast and super easy. And if you better want to see what object you are currently sculpting on, you can go up here to the viewport overlays and enable Fade Inactive Geometry. And then you can use this slider here to gray out all the objects you're currently not sculpting on. And before we forget, let's switch to object mode and help little Godzilla to unroll his exercise mat. Have fun exercising! So while little Godzilla is doing some yoga exercises here and is trying to balance on one foot, let's try to balance our viewport navigation a bit more. Right now with our default setting we basically can just rotate our view, but we can't really roll our camera here. And since sculpting, especially with a graphics tablet and a pen, feels a bit like drawing on a sheet of paper, which you also rotate around every time you need a better angle to draw, it can be really useful to have the same behavior here. And first of all, let's make a little stroke here on our sculpture. Since we enabled orbit around selection before, we are now orbiting around our last stroke here. And now we can press the shortcut Shift numpad 4 to rotate left or Shift numpad 6 to rotate right. And in this way we can find a better angle to sculpt here on our little Godzilla. If the increments are too strong, you can press Ctrl, to open up the preferences and change the rotation angle here, for example to 5 degrees, and then the steps are not that big anymore, as you can see. Let's press numpad 1 to get back to the front view, which also straightens our view. And there's a second method which allows us to roll our view more organically. For that, with Ctrl, let's get back to the preferences, go to navigation, and up here the turntable orbit method is enabled, which is the default method to rotate around our objects. However, we also have trackball. Let's enable this. And here with the orbit sensitivity, you can enable how fast you rotate around the view. So let's increase this a bit because usually it's a bit slow. And now in order to rotate around our object, first of all let's stay at the center here of our 3D viewport, hold down middle mouse button, click, and then move up and down to rotate vertically, or move left and right to rotate horizontally. And now when you move your mouse to the border of the 3D viewport, you can kind of grab the 3D viewport and roll the view. So for example, if we go up here and we want to sculpt here, we can roll the view to the specific angle we like, and then we can continue sculpting here. So this is something you have to get used to, but if you get used to it, it can really enhance your experience while sculpting in Blender. Oh, is it just me, or has little Godzilla already lost some weight? Anyway, continue with your squats. In the meantime, I created a dumbbell for Godzilla, but now I want to go to sculpt mode and polish this up a bit. So let's switch over to sculpt mode. However, we get this warning down here, object has non-uniform scale, and you can see that our brush is deformed weirdly. So let's press T and maybe try a different brush, but as you can see, it applies to all the brushes here. And if I now start sculpting, everything looks super weird. Well, that's because the scale of the object is not applied. Let's undo this mess and go back into object mode. Let's press N, and over here under item we can see that the scale is non-uniform. So we have a different scale for X, Y, and Z. And these scale values will apply to our sculpting tools and also other areas in Blender. So to better understand, let's quickly add a new object here, like a simple cube. And whenever we create a new object, it has the default scale of 111. And now we start to scale the object here in object mode. Maybe make it a bit flatter, change the size here and maybe here. And now you can see the scale has changed. However, Blender still remembers the original scale. So if I press Alt S to reset the scale, you can see Blender remembered the shape of the cube and now the scale is back at 111. However, what if I want to have this new shape, which I created, be the default scale of this object? For that, we simply have to apply the scale. So let's go to Object, Apply, or more easily, press Ctrl A and then you open up the apply menu and then apply the scale. Now you can see the shape of the object is not changing, but the scale is set back to 111. So whenever I do now any changes here, maybe something like this, and with Alt S reset the scale, we now get this shape here. So and this scale change is also applying to all the tools and brushes we are using on our objects. Let's get rid of this cube and now let's get back to the dumbbell here. That means if this is selected, I press Ctrl A and apply the scale, you can see the shape is not changing at all, but the scale is set back to 111. And that means if I now switch over to sculpt mode, our brushes appear perfectly fine here. So whenever you have weird behavior of your brushes, make sure in object mode with Ctrl A, the scale is applied. oh, I think little Godzilla is ready to use the dumbbell here. However, let's quickly switch over to it with Alt Q and clean up the faceting here with holding down Shift. However, it's best to mirror this so we don't have to do both sides individually. So let's enable X symmetry and let's test it out. And you can see the mirroring is for whatever reason not working. And you can see this little dot here which shows where the mirrored brush appears, and it is not really mirrored on this side here. So let's undo this and let's switch over to object mode and see what's going on here. And with the move tool enabled and up here the local transform orientation selected, you can see on the one hand the origin of the object is not at the center, and the origin is also rotated weirdly. So when mirroring along the x-axis, it will use this specific axis. So how can we fix that? The most simplest way is to use the apply menu by pressing Ctrl A and then apply the rotation. This quickly adjusts the rotation of the axis. However, the origin is still down here and it needs to be here at the center. So what you can do is to right click, set origin to geometry. When your object is symmetrical, like in my case, then the origin will be placed perfectly at the center. However, what to do when your object is not perfectly symmetrical nor perfectly straight lying in the scene? You can always go up here to options, affect only origins, then make sure you have the move tool enabled, and then you can move the origin around without moving the object, and you can also rotate the origin, so you can manually adjust the origin to exactly the axis you need. However, in my case, let's press Alt R to reset the rotation since the origin already lies perfectly at the center here, and then let's disable origins. And now let's switch back to sculpt mode. Let's hold down Shift, and now I can smooth this out here and it will mirror perfectly on the other side, as you can see on this little dot there. So now little Godzilla of course wants to train both arms, so we need a second dumbbell. But I don't want to copy this over because I still want to be able to symmetrically sculpt on this one dumbbell, and everything I do here should also be reflected on the mirrored dumbbell. And for this you can use the mirror modifier, which also works in sculpt mode. So let's go to the modifiers with the dumbbell selected, add modifier and search for mirror. However, by default it's using the object's origin to mirror the object, so in this case both dumbbells are just lying on top of each other. But we can also use a mirror object, so the origin of another object as mirroring axis. And in this case we have our little Godzilla here, where the origin lies directly at the center. So we can simply use the eyedropper, click on Godzilla here, and voila, it's mirrored to the other side. However, if you don't have an object with a perfectly centered origin point, you can use a new object. With Shift C, let's recenter the 3D cursor here, and then let's hit Shift A, go to empty and add a plane axis. This is an empty object which will not be rendered, and then you can press F2, call it mirror, so you can easily find it, and then here on our dumbbells, instead of Godzilla, let's use the mirror object. And now depending on the position of this object, you can see the mirroring is changing. And the cool thing now is that we can select the dumbbell, go to sculpt mode, and here still sculpt on this one dumbbell symmetrically, and this will then also be mirrored on the other side. Looking good, little Godzilla. But Zach, I hear you ask, what if my sculpture is non-symmetrical and I still want to mirror an object to the other side? And as you can see with the mirror modifier, this is not really working, of course. So let's get rid of this and let's try a different approach. So I want to mirror this over to the other side, but change the position, but still be able to sculpt on one dumbbell, and everything I do here should also be reflected on the other dumbbell. For this, let's press Shift C to set the 3D cursor to the center of the world. Let's press numpad 1 for the front view, and let's set the transform pivot point, which is currently here at the center of our object, to the 3D cursor. Now it's down here, but it's still aligned to the local axis of this object, so let's change the transform orientation to global. And now I duplicate this, but not with Shift D, but with Alt D. Then right click or escape, so it jumps back, so we still have the duplicate here. And by duplicating something with Alt D, both objects will now use the exact same mesh information. You can see in the first dumbbell we have cylinder 002, and in the second one it's exactly the same. That means if I change the mesh in any way in edit mode or in sculpt mode, this will be changed on both objects. And now we just need to mirror it over to the other side, and for this we have the global transform orientation and pivot point set to 3D cursor. Now press Ctrl M and press X for the x-axis, then enter to confirm, and now we can set this back to bounding box center and this back to local if we want. And now let's quickly move it to the right position, something like this. And now if I go to sculpt mode from this one here and make any changes here. Let's disable symmetry so we can really see if it's doing it correctly. Let's do something here. And now you can see it's perfectly mirrored to the other side. And also here you can see we are editing both objects simultaneously since both objects are sharing the mesh information. However, keep one thing in mind. Let's go over to object mode. This object here, let's press N, go to item, has now a negative scale on the x-axis. That means at some point you might want to disconnect these two objects from each other. So maybe you want to make some changes here which should not be visible on this dumbbell. For this, simply select the object, press Ctrl A and apply the scale. Then you get this message, create new object data users and apply transform. Hit OK. And now you can see we have different name here for the mesh information of the dumbbell. So both objects are disconnected. So that means when I sculpt something over here, it will not be reflected over here. But you can see that this object kind of looks weird. And that's because the negative scale was reversed. Now we have a positive scale here on the x-axis. And this caused that all the faces of the object were flipped. We can see this up here if we go to the viewport overlays and enable face orientation. Everything blue is correct and everything red is not correct. So the inside of the faces are now pointing to the outside. Quick side note, when the normals of the faces are inverted, the brushes in sculpt mode will also be inverted. That means although I have add enabled up here, the plus, I will remove geometry here from the surface. So the flipped normals will also have an effect on the sculpting process. Anyway, to quickly fix this, go to edit mode, select everything here and press Shift N. You can also find it up here under mesh, normals, and then recalculate outside. Then if I go back to object mode, this appears blue, the scale is correct. And now I have two separate objects and little Godzilla is a bit too blue here. So let's disable face orientation. I'm currently in sculpt mode of Godzilla here and you can see symmetry is disabled. So let's enable symmetry so we can sculpt here. And this will be mirrored on the other side, of course. However, if with Alt Q I now switch over to the dumbbell, you can see symmetry is disabled. So symmetry is a setting which you have to enable per object. However, there's a cool trick. If you want to enable symmetry for multiple objects, simply go to object mode. With Shift, select all the objects where you want to have symmetry enabled, go to sculpt mode, and then simply hold down Alt while changing this setting here. And now with Alt Q, let's switch over to other objects, and you can see symmetry is enabled for all the selected objects. Little Godzilla is taking a break. Oh, well, not really. Now you're training your brain as well. I can see you're studying the sculpting shortcuts in our Blender shortcut PDF. Not bad. But did you know it has not only the sculpt mode related shortcuts, but all other important Blender shortcuts as well, listed on 14 pages? And with a clickable menu, it can bring you to the desired shortcuts in no time. And for everyone not living in Blender's 3D viewport, there's even a version optimized for printing. And we also keep it fresh with each major Blender update. We also update this shortcut PDF. You can get it at cgboost.com/resources, link below. I'm using a Multires modifier for little Godzilla here. That means if I disable this, you can see we have a low resolution base mesh, and when I re-enable this, we can see all the nicely sculpted details which are stored in this Multires modifier. And now to help little Godzilla with his dumbbell training, let's increase the biceps here a bit, only to realize that we forgot to enable symmetry. So we have one nicely shaped biceps here, but not on the other side. But the problem is Symmetrize does not work with the Multires modifier. Or does it? Well, it does. However, you have to disable the Multires modifier first, and then you can symmetrize it. So in this case, we want to go from the positive X direction to the negative. So from this side to this side. That means here, make sure that positive X to negative X is enabled, and then click on Symmetrize. And now see the magic. If I re-enable Multires, we have the nicely shaped biceps also on the other side. You might need to fix some minor mirroring issues here at the center. No big deal. So while little Godzilla is jumping rope here, let's quickly open up a new file, General, and here we just need the default cube. I want to show you how to drastically improve the performance when using the Multires modifier for sculpting. Right now the cube has no subdivisions, so let's add some subdivisions with the Multires modifier. And then let's click on subdivide a couple of times. So now I have 10 subdivisions. Down here, right click and enable scene statistics, so we can see we have around 6 million faces on this sphere, which was a cube. Now let's switch over to sculpt mode, and then let's sculpt here, and you can see nothing, and that's because the performance is super laggy. So yeah, it takes ages to just make one stroke. But there is a way to have the same amount of faces, but still have a buttery smooth sculpting experience when using the Multires modifier. For this, let's go back to object mode, remove the Multires modifier, and for now, let's just add a simple subdivision surface modifier and maybe subdivide it like 4 or 5 times, so we have a good base subdivision, and then apply this. Now in edit mode you can see this is our new base mesh here, and if we are now adding a multi-resolution modifier and subdividing it until we have 6 million faces, which we have now with 5 subdivisions, but you can see 6 million faces, and if I now go to sculpt mode, you can see how buttery smooth the sculpting experience is here using the Multires modifier. So as you can see, it's very important that the base mesh has a proper subdivision before using the Multires modifier. Now let's imagine we want to sculpt on the skipping rope here. However, when I click here and go to the modifiers, you can see it consists out of many modifiers. So originally I just have this very basic edge here, which I mirrored, subdivided, used the skin modifier to add geometry, subdivided this again, and added some details with displacement. That means if I switch over to sculpt mode, you can see I can't really do anything here. Under options, I can enable use deform only, and then I see what I can actually deform, which is only this edge here. So let's switch back to object mode, and there's an easy way to apply all the modifiers at once, which also works when multiple objects are selected. So here, for example, I also have some modifiers. So let's select these 2 objects, press Ctrl A, which we usually use to apply the scale, but we can also apply the visual geometry to mesh. So basically what we see will be converted into a mesh. You can see all the modifiers disappeared, and this applies for both objects. And now we can join these 2 objects, for example, with Ctrl J. Then let's switch to sculpt mode, and here we could use the voxel remesher to remesh the whole thing and merge everything into each other. So for this we can press R to set a resolution, so in this case we need to be very low, maybe something like 0.005, and then we can press Ctrl R, or up here press the remesh button to remesh everything. And now over here you can see that both objects are really merged into each other, and we could start sculpting on the object. And here's another quick example with how I created the dumbbell. You can see I have many different objects, and all these objects have a lot of modifiers, and I even have a text object here. So I can simply select everything, make sure with shift left click one object is active, and then press Ctrl A visual geometry to mesh, then with Ctrl J join everything, and then in sculpt mode I can press R, set a resolution, and then press Ctrl R to remesh everything, and then everything is merged into just one object, as you can see. Doesn't make sense in all cases, but sometimes it can really be useful for sculpting. Oh nice, now Little Godzilla is working out with the resistance band. However, I told you should drink enough water, now you lost a little bit of resolution here. Dang it. Well, luckily we have the voxel remesher here, so let's go here. Let's pick the resolution, and now let's increase the resolution a bit. So in this case we need to lower the voxel size, and then let's remesh this. All in all, looking good. However, when using the voxel remesher, we usually lose details, especially when we have sharp creases, or what's even worse, when we have geometry which lies very close to each other, it can be merged too, which is not really what we want here. So let's undo this. If you want to increase the resolution of your object for sculpting without losing the details, we can use dynamic topology. So let's enable dynamic topology. Here you can simply hit OK, and then here either switch to constant detail or manual detail. Then let's pick the resolution on a spot where we have quite high resolution. So let's go here, for example. So we have a value of 120, and in this case a higher value means a higher resolution. But don't go too crazy with it, because here we already have a quite high resolution opposed to this area. So I think in this case I just leave it as it is, and then we have this detail flood fill. So if I now click this button here or press Ctrl R, the whole mesh will be filled with this specific resolution. However, keep in mind the voxel remesher is much faster, so this will take a short while. Let's click this. So this took a few seconds, and now you can see all in all the mesh looks pretty much the same. No fingers were merged, and here we still have all the details as before. However, when you have Dyntopo enabled, you can see it gets quite slow, so definitely disable dynamic topology afterwards. Then let's click up here and enable wireframe, set it to 1, and now you can see we have a much higher resolution here. Keep in mind though that the whole mesh will be triangulated, so if you have a quad-based mesh before, you will lose that. However, now we have a much higher resolution here. We can start adding details, so let's disable wireframe. We can smooth this area here, and then we can add higher resolution details here very nicely, as you can see. But keep in mind, this workflow does not work if you want to merge objects like I showed you in the previous tip. Let's use the grab brush, and sometimes you want to change the thickness of fingers or other thin elements here. And when I try to do this with the grab brush, you can see I'm not only deforming this one finger, but also the finger next to it. And of course we could set up masks here to protect certain areas. However, the grab brush has also this nice feature, grab silhouette. And this allows us to only grab the silhouette of the mesh, which then will also only affect a certain area. Now I can make this finger thicker, as you can see, without affecting the other ones. Pretty nice. But yeah, in actual fact, we want to make them thinner here, so sorry. You know what, I thought we can help Little Godzilla to lose some weight here on the sides, and for this obviously we would use the Flatten brush. However, if I use the Flatten brush here, you can see it's not really removing and flattening the surface, it's kind of creating this plateau here. So it's basically pushing everything below the brush upwards and everything above the brush downwards. So this is not really what I want. Instead, what I would recommend when you try to flatten areas is to use the Scrape Peaks brush. Here you can much more easily remove surfaces and flatten surfaces. Of course you get these harsh lines, but when holding down Shift you can easily smooth the whole area here. And then you can get rid of certain areas or flatten and polish certain areas much easier. I love this brush. Sometimes you want to intensify the details on your sculpture. In this case, let's help Little Godzilla to grow the abs here. And for this we can use the smooth brush, but of course not with a regular smoothing function, but with the inverted brush, which will sharpen this area here. So if I hold down Control, you can see I can sharpen the details on the surface. However, this can cause some little artifacts. There are also other brushes which allow similar results. For example, the Flatten brush, which is actually called Flatten Contrast. That means instead of flattening, we can hold down Control and add more contrast to the details. You can see it's a bit softer than inverting the smooth brush, so this is great to make bigger details stronger and more intense. And while this inverted brush is pushing the geometry above the brush up and the geometry below the brush down, you can also go with the Fill Deepen brush. Usually this fills gaps and creases. However, if down here invert to scrape is disabled, you can hold down Control to invert this, and then everything under the brush will be pushed downwards, so you can deepen creases, for example. And then you have the opposite. If you use the scrape brush, which I showed you before, to nicely flatten the surface, you can also invert this, but before make sure invert to fill is disabled, and then everything above the brush will be pushed up and everything below the brush will not be touched. But in general, I like the inverted flatten brush and the inverted smooth brush most to enhance details here. While Little Godzilla here is trying to lose weight, we can help him a bit with the grab brush, for example, which allows us to grab the surface and move it around, as you can see. However, by default, the brush will influence the surface as if there is a sphere placed around our brush. So it's basically as if I would move a sphere around our mesh and everything within the sphere will be influenced. In most cases, this is perfect. However, sometimes I want to make bigger changes to the mesh, and for this we can go over to Falloff and change the Falloff shape to projected. That means instead of a sphere, we are projecting the effect of the brush throughout the entire mesh from our view. You can see the brush is not aligning to the surface anymore, it's just one circle from our view. Now if I make a change here, it's basically going through the entire mesh. So that means if I make a change here, it will go through the entire mesh and also make the change on the other side. To better illustrate what's going on here is when you use the brush here, it's basically using our view to project like an infinite cylinder, and everything within the cylinder will be deformed. And in some cases, this can be extremely helpful. While we are talking about the brush behavior, sometimes I find it quite annoying that when I zoom in, my brush becomes smaller compared to our sculpture, or when I zoom out, it becomes bigger. So currently the brush size stays the same compared to our screen pixels, but not compared to our sculpture. But this you can easily change by going up here to brush and change the radius unit from view to scene. Now the brush size will always stay the same in comparison to the sculpture. So if I zoom in here, you can see compared to our screen, the brush will be bigger, but compared to the object, it stays the same size. And if I zoom back, you can see it will get smaller because our sculpture also gets smaller. This can be very handy, especially when you start sculpting details on the surface, and no matter how far or close you zoom, you want all the details to always stay the same size. When you watched this video till this point, I assume you're interested in digital sculpting using Blender. If you're looking for a place to learn everything important about sculpting in Blender with clear and thorough instructions, then check out my comprehensive and fun Master 3D Sculpting in Blender course. Here you will learn all the sculpting fundamentals, create a cute creature from scratch including sculpting, retopology, coloring and rendering. And you'll learn all the details about every single sculpting brush and tool, and you can practice sculpting in 13 fun little challenges. As a nice side effect, when you purchase any of our courses, you support the creation of more free tutorials here on YouTube. To learn more about the course, click the link in the video description. Let's get back to Little Godzilla here, and last time I talked to him, he wanted to start walking 10,000 steps a day, and oh my gosh, Little Godzilla, you made amazing progress! And this just by walking 10,000 steps a day? Incredible. Well, I think we can still help you a bit here on your apps and make them look a bit stronger. For this, let's enable wireframe, set it to 1. And for adding sharp creases, we can use the Draw Sharp brush or the crease brush. The difference here is that the Draw Sharp brush just adds a sharp line without pinching the geometry. The crease brush, on the other hand, adds a sharp line, but at the same time it is pinching the geometry, so we get a much sharper line here. Down here we have a pinch value, so if the pinching is too strong or too weak, you can adjust this. However, I still find it a bit hard to control how strong the crease should be and how sharp it should be at the same time when using the crease brush. So instead I love to use the Draw Sharp brush first to define how strong the crease should be, and after that I use the pinch brush to define how strong the pinching should be. And in this way we can control much more precisely how much pinching we want. We can also change the brush size, and then we can define exactly what we need. And the same also applies for the edges. For example, if I want to have a sharper edge here, we can invert the Draw Sharp brush with Control and then also use the pinch brush to pinch this here. Let's disable wireframe, and this is how it looks. Dang, now look at these apps here. However, we have now pinched the geometry quite a bit. So if I re-enable wireframe here, you can see that the topology here is not really even. I'm using a Multires modifier, by the way. And sometimes you want to even out the topology here without changing the shape of the object. And for this, the Slide Relax brush is extremely useful. All you need to do is to hold down Shift to enable the smooth option, and then we can relax the topology here and still preserve the overall shape on the mesh. Let's disable wireframe here, and you can see it looks pretty much the same, but we have a much better topology. Hey Little Godzilla, why you're sad? What, you caught a splinter last time you were running? Show it to me. Oh, shit, that looks painful. Well, worry no more, we will help you. For this, first of all, we need to cover the splinter in a facet. For this, we could use the Draw Facets tool here. However, instead, let's use the Expand Facet by Topology tool, which you can enable with Shift W. So let's hover above here and hit Shift W, and then we can expand the facet based on the topology. And if you look down in the info bar, there are many other shortcuts which you can press in addition to this. For example, F to invert this, or what I really love is holding down space so you can reposition where you want to start with the facet. So this can be really helpful if you don't cover the right space immediately. And then let's confirm with left click, and then we can use the Draw Facets tool. Hold down Control while hovering above the facet and continue drawing this specific facet. And if you have drawn too much, you can hover above the other area, hold down Control, and then kind of erase the facet. So in this way you can quickly add facets by topology to your objects. And by the way, the same applies to masks. Here we also have the Expand Mask by Topology, but then you have to use the shortcut Shift A. So let's quickly test this. Shift A, and then you can expand the mask by the topology, and for example also hold hold down space to change the position where you want to start this mask. But let's cancel this because this time we need a face set. So now we still have the splinter here. What we could do now is of course using the trim tools and try to cut away the splinter. But since we now have a nice face set here, it is much easier. All we need to do is to go to Sculpt and click on Fair Positions and then click on the face set. And whoop, you can see it's gone. However, although we kind of cut away this geometry here, we still have the same amount of faces. If I enable wireframe here, you can see it basically just flattened the surface and kept all the geometry here. So this is great when using this with the Multires modifier. However, if you're not working with the Multires modifier and you don't want to have one spot with all these details here, you can either use the detail flood fill, which I showed you earlier, to fill in the entire mesh with one resolution, or the remeshing, or if you just want to fix this one spot here, you can enable dynamic topology, hit OK, then let's sample the resolution here around this spot. And then use the simplify brush. Don't worry, it will automatically triangulate your mesh since we have dynamic topology enabled. And now we can simply draw over this area to get rid of the higher amount of details. And then little Godzilla should be happy again. Hey little Godzilla, I hope you enjoy your new running shoes here, so no splinters will bother you in the future. And while little Godzilla is standing in this kind of A pose here, let's have a look at the mask menu. You can find it up here with a bunch of options. However, what I really like to use is the shortcut with the mask pie menu. Let's hold down A and then this pie menu appears. But to make use of it, we actually need a mask. So let's use the topology mask, which we learned about earlier. Let's go to the tip of the finger here and hit Shift A, and then let's drag out this topology mask. And if something like this appears here, let's have a look at the info bar, and when we press 2 on the keyboard, we can switch to the topology fall off. Let's go to somewhere here, and then down here let's press Shift A once again and draw another mask here once again and here once again. And over here let's hit Shift A, and then let's use the invert function with F, and then we can get rid of this here. So now we have this nice mask. However, the edge does not really look nice. So let's smooth this out using the mask menu. Let's press and hold A, and then let's click on smooth mask. And down here we can adjust the mask filter. However, if we increase the iterations here, nothing is happening. First, you have to disable auto iteration count. And now you can freely adjust how smooth the mask should be. Then if I hit A once again, we can also grow the mask or shrink the mask. And by the way, it remembers the last settings we have here, so we can even lower this so it's only shrinking or growing a bit. And sometimes if you want to clean up the mask edges, you can also increase the contrast here, but again, not that strong, to get a sharper, cleaner line. However, in this case, I want to have a quite smooth mask. And this is useful in the next tip. So now we have this mask on the arm, and now let's rotate the arm. So we want to pose the arm using this mask. However, first of all, let's press Ctrl I to invert the mask so that everything is masked except the arms. Let's press M to use the mask brush and mask out this area a bit more. And with holding down Shift, we can smooth the area even more. Now down here, we find the transform tools for moving, rotating, and scaling. And here let's use the rotate tool. However, you can see the pivot point is somewhere down here, and if I rotate it, it looks super weird. However, if we go up here to the sculpt menu under set pivot, we can set the pivot to specific positions, for example, into the unmasked area. Now it's at the center of the unmasked area, but still this is not what we want. So let's go here once again. And what's very useful here is to set it to the mask border. For whatever reason, it jumped to the other side, but it doesn't matter. We have symmetry enabled, and now it's here at the border of our mask. And it's much easier when we click on this white circle to rotate the arm and to adjust it. And if the position is not correct, we can also use the move tool and drag it down a bit. And there's another handy shortcut. With Shift right click, you can manually place the pivot point wherever you like. However, keep in mind it will always place the pivot point on the surface then. So the position from where you're looking at the model is also important. So you can place it somewhere here and then make use of the transform tools. However, there's a much better way to pose your characters in sculpt mode, which needs a bit of preparation. First of all, let's disable the multi-res modifier. It will also work with a multi-res modifier enabled or with a mesh with a higher resolution. However, this can slow down the process quite a bit. Now with this disabled, let's add some quick facets here. I have symmetry enabled. Then let's go to the tip of the finger, press Shift W to add the facet based on the topology. Let's go to somewhere here, and then let's add another one for the lower arm and another one for the hand. And if you don't cover everything, let's go to the Draw Facets tool, hold down Control above this red facet, and then let's draw in the missing areas. Same over here, something like this. And now if you want to have a non-symmetrical pose, you can of course disable symmetry, but here let's leave it enabled. And now let's go to the Pose tool, let's go to the brush settings, set the deformation to rotate twist and the rotation origins to facets FK, which is the easiest to adjust. And then when you hover above the facets, you can see this line here, and then you can rotate this specific facet. And if you hold down Control and click and move, you can even twist this. And this allows us to easily adjust the arm in no time. And if you want to move the facets around, you can change the deformation to Scale Translate, hold down Control and then left click and then move this. If you don't hold Control, you can scale the arms. Wow, look at that. But yeah, let's hold down Control, then we can shift them down a bit. And this easily you can pose your characters. And if I add some quick facets here to the tail, we can also do it here. Let's change this back to rotate and twist. However, symmetry needs to be disabled. So let's disable this and then we can move this. However, you can see the transition is now very harsh, but what you can do is to increase the smooth iteration and then the whole thing will be a bit smoother, as you can see. And if you like, you can also play around with the facets and increase the IK segments. Let's set it to 3 because we have 3 segments here, and then you have a whole bone chain of elements. And if the smooth iteration is not high enough, let's increase this even more, and then we can easily pose the tail here. However, using these segments, it's a bit harder to control. Yeah, and then all we need to do is to re-enable the multi-res modifier, and we still have all our nice details. And by the way, up here you can also hide the facets if they are in the way. On the official Blender website, you can download human base meshes, which are especially made for sculpting. Simply follow the link in the video description and click on this image to download the zip file. You can also find a dedicated tutorial if you click here. Then after unpacking the zip file, you find the blend file, which you can open, and then it looks something like this. And the cool thing is this is CC0 license, so that means you can use these for any of your projects, no matter if these are personal or commercial projects. And we find this handy asset library down here, and we can even save it to be able to access this from any blend file. For this, press Ctrl, to open up the preferences, go to File Path, and here let's create a new asset library. Make sure to find a spot on your hard drive where you want to save your asset libraries and click on Add Asset Library. Let's double click Assets and call it Human Base Meshes, and under Import Method make sure to set it to Append. Then let's close this window here and click this Copy to Asset Library button and choose Human Base Meshes. Then this window pops up and then simply click on Copy to Asset Library. So and after that we can simply go to File, New, or open an existing project. Here let's open a general file. Let's get rid of all these objects here, drag out the timeline and switch this over to the asset browser. And then we find the human base meshes here with different categories. So we have these planar objects, which we then can simply drag and drop into our scene. Primitives, so these different characters, realistic and stylized, and also simple head objects. And we also have the realistic objects, a female and a male character, but also individual elements like the hand, a foot, the jaw, and even a skull. And the skull even has realistic details with the multi-res modifier, as you can see. And then we also have the stylized characters, female and male, and individual objects here. And some of these objects come even with specific face sets, which we can use to pose a hand, for example, as I showed you earlier. And these objects also have a nice topology and are quad based. That means you can easily add a multi-resolution modifier, subdivide the mesh, and then everything looks pretty nice. Let's go back to the primitives here and let's drag and drop this stylized character, for example. Right now, this is an instant. That means I can't select the individual elements. But before you do anything else here, let's go down here and disable instance. If you don't have this menu here, either press F9, or if you have a different menu here, then remove this character and drag and drop this into the scene again. Now let's move this down here. Let's select the hip, press Alt G to reset the position, and then move it along the Z-axis to the top here. and now this has a couple of useful features. First of all, you can see the origins are at the right spot when you rotate the objects, so you can easily pose them, and the specific objects are parented to each other. So I can rotate the shoulders here, then the whole arm will move, then I can move the lower arm here, you can see the hand will move along, and the fingers are sticking to the hand. That means you can easily adjust the pose of the character if you like, and this even applies to the other body parts. And this character also uses a trick which I showed you earlier. The mirrored objects are linked to each other. That means if I go to sculpt mode and make any changes here, this will also be applied automatically on the other side. But the cool thing is you can have a non-symmetrical pose here, and this will still work then. So if I make any changes here, you can see how this applies over here. And then at some point when you want to apply the scale, maybe you have made this bigger and make some crazy changes, then simply select everything. And now if you would apply the scale, you get an error message. Well, you get a ton of error messages because the objects are linked to each other, and then you can't apply the scale. Before, you have to convert everything into individual objects. For this, go to Object, Relations, Make Single User, Object and Data. And now if I apply the scale, everything works fine. And you can see all the objects have these subsurf modifiers. So we can also press Ctrl A and apply the visual geometry to mesh. Now you can sculpt on the objects individually. And of course, with Ctrl J, you can join everything. And in sculpt mode, press R, set a resolution. And then with Ctrl R, remesh everything so everything is nicely merged together. Yeah, so the Blender Foundation provided here an awesome resource for getting started with sculpting humans. Which gives me an idea. Let's open up Little Godzilla again and add this stylized human base mesh and adjust the proportions of the different body parts. Let's cut off Little Godzilla's head. Sorry, but you won't regret it, I promise. Now let's merge some parts of the body, drag out the tail and sculpt in some shapes. Let's also get Little Godzilla's feet, ouch, and move them over. And while we're at it, let's also grab the hands. Then let's add more muscles and shape the body. Then let's merge the head, hands and feet to the body and adjust the shapes. More muscles of course, and cleaning up everything. After that, let's cut off the dorsal plates of Little Godzilla, move them over, adjust the position and shape and merge them with the new body. Some final tweaks, and of course let's add some reptile style abs, and voila, ready is Little Godzilla's new body. Well, good you're living in the digital world, because here nothing is impossible. And good news, less workout for you, my friend. Alright, one final bonus tip. When you go to exosite.com and here click on the Quad Remesher download, you can download a 30-day trial of this Quad Remesher add-on. To test it with all its features, you just have to enter your email here and then you get a download link sent to your email. And when you're convenient with this, you can also buy a license here for the full version. It's definitely not a cheap add-on, however, this is so valuable, especially if you're sculpting a lot. So back in Blender, I installed the add-on. You can find all the info on how to do this on the website exosite.com, which I just showed you. And if I quickly enable wireframe, you can see that the topology of the mesh is pretty ugly. And especially if I want to pose Little Godzilla here, it's not ideal to work with this topology. And this is where the Quad Remesher comes in handy, because this is basically retopologizing your objects. Let's select Little Godzilla here, press N, and then go to Quad Remesh. And here I don't want to dive into all the settings because all you really need is the quad count. So you can define how many quads the final mesh should have. In my case, I want to go with 10K. And since my mesh is symmetrical, I want to have X symmetry enabled. Of course, make sure that the origin of the object is directly here at the center. And if not, you can right click, set origin to geometry. And then all you have to do is click remesh it. Down here you can see the progress, and usually it's quite fast. So remeshing succeeded. Then let's press N, and now we have a new Retopo Godzilla, and we still have the original lying around here. And if I quickly enable flat shading, you can see that the topology in general is really good. It might not be perfect, but it's close to perfect. The only areas which are maybe not ideal are the eyes here and maybe the teeth, but still it does a very good job. So, but how to get all the nice details from our original sculpture back? Well, it's actually quite easy. On the Retopo object, add a multi-resolution modifier and subdivide it, in this case maybe 3 times. Then after that, search for the shrink wrap modifier and add it, set the wrap method to project, enable negative, and as target, pick the original Godzilla. And voila, the new mesh is projected on the details of the old mesh here. And then all there's left to do is to apply the shrink wrap modifier, which then will store this deformation in the multi-res modifier. So if I disable this, we still have our original base mesh, and if I enable it, we have all the nice details. And of course, we can now go to sculpt mode, and if we like, we could even add more details here, which are then stored in the multi-res modifier. So then with the multi-res modifier disabled and the pose brush here, we can easily give little Godzilla a pose as I showed you before. And now if we re-enable the multi-res modifier, we don't have little Godzilla anymore, we have Godzano Schwarzilla. Man, little Godzilla has come a long way. I hope these tips in this video helped you to grow your sculpting skills, similar as little Godzilla has grown his muscles. So let me know in the comments below which was your favorite tip, and if you have any other secret Blender sculpting tips to share, leave them in the comments as well. I always love to learn more. Remember to download our Blender shortcut PDF and to check out our Blender sculpting course, links below, and make sure to subscribe to this channel, since if you do so, more useful tutorials are heading your way very soon. That's it from me and little Godzilla. Say goodbye.
Goodbye.